I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a process for preparing your speeches. I'd recommend it for your informative speech, and in fact, I'd recommend it for most types of presentations that you would give. And I'm going to argue for this process. Obviously, you don't have to use it, but I think it's a good way of approaching speeches. Because often what happens is people tend to think of preparing a speech as a linear process, right? They say, well, I figure out what I'm going to talk about, I draft up the outline, I practice the outline, and I deliver it. And that's not really the most beneficial way, I think, of preparing a speech. Speeches don't sort of flow in that linear fashion in terms of their preparation. And what will happen is somebody might make an early decision that makes sense at the time, but then it doesn't end up actually working out for what they want to deliver, but they're locked into that bad content because they put it down on paper. Peggy Noonan, who was one of Ronald Reagan's speechwriters, had this great line, where you falter, alter. And I think there's so much going on in that quotation. If you're making a mistake with your notes or with your script, you change it. Change it. Don't pretend like you're not going to make that mistake again. Don't try to ignore it. If you're having a problem, change what you've written so that you can deliver it in a way that works for you. And so this process that I'm going to be talking about for developing your speech is about fitting your content to your delivery and fitting your delivery to your content. And so what I'm going to suggest is not really a linear way of preparing your speech, but is much more cyclical. It's a way that incorporates practicing and revisioning as well as drafting. So I want to talk about what this cycle is, the composition cycle. Then I want to talk a little bit about how this cycle can help you prepare a speech. And then actually what I'm going to do, because I do this all the time, is I'm going to walk you through a 45-minute talk that I gave and show you the various, very briefly because it would take forever, the various drafts that I went through to get it from raw idea through these various iterations to the final product. So just in terms of the basic components of this composition cycle. Well, before we get into it, I would say there's a planning stage, sort of trying to figure out what the speech is, your first pass on it, getting all the components together. And then you enter this cycle of running the speech, reflecting on the speech, revising the speech, running the speech, reflecting on it, revising, so on and so forth. But at that planning stage, what you're doing is you're kind of figuring out how the topic and the audience and the speaker and the time limits all fit together. You're doing maybe some initial background work to sort of shore up the research that you need in order to pull together this sort of huge, massive draft, this initial draft. By the way, in terms of where we are in the class, that's what the rest of this week is about, is a lot of these sort of big picture invention components, these big planning components, getting all this down. But then once that initial planning is down, then you're just sort of making changes to the draft as you're practicing it. You're doing revising within that. So here's sort of and I would distinguish between how I would approach using this cycle to help with speech composition, how I approach it as an ideal model, what I want to do, and then a shorter model if I'm tight on time. But let me walk you through sort of the ideal model. So in the ideal model, I've got sort of my first path, and that first pass is finding my way, just figuring out what the heck I'm going to be doing in this speech. In terms of drafting, I'm trying to get as many ideas down on paper as I can. So I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to think through invention, what are the topics that have to be addressed? I'm trying to think through goals. What are the goals for this presentation for my audience? What's all the research I can pull into this, all the evidence I want to talk about, and I just make a massive draft. Usually, and I'm doing this on my computer, this is pages long. And so I've got almost everything down. And then once I've spent some time on that, maybe a day, depending on how big the presentation is, maybe an hour on that, maybe a day on that, depending on how far out I am from it, I pull that massive draft together, and then once I feel like I got almost everything there, I take that, I set it to the side, maybe I print out a copy, or I often just read it off my computer, and then I just talk my way through what I've got. So I'm actually running the speech, and there's no use in timing this. I mean, it'll go, way over time. That's not what it's about. It's about starting to internalize all that information, figuring out what are the elements that are going to work, what are the elements that I like. So after I've planned it, I do a run-through. Then after I do that run-through and it goes 1,000 hours or however, it doesn't go that long, but after I've done that initial run-through, I sit down and I reflect. Okay, what what happened there? What did I like talking about? What didn't I like talking about? What, when I was talking through it, was I like, I am BSing at the moment. Thankfully, no one's around. This sounds awful. So I'm trying to think about what are the big things going on in this speech. After I'm done with that reflection, I start making revisions. I jump back into that massive outline document, and I'm making big changes. I'm going in and I'm thinking, you know what? That entire second half of the speech needs to go. Or these goals that I had for the audience, I need to change these because they're not going to be doable in the time that I have. Or I'm like, oh, my second point I like, but I have no idea what I'm talking about there. I need to go find actual research to back up what I'm saying there. So that revision is a lot of really big changes. Okay, so I've done some planning, I run it, I reflect on it, I revise it, and then I run it again. But now I'm in phase 2, right? The second pass on this speech. I would say this is sort of, if I'm going to label this one, this is redefining the speech. So I'm running it. Certainly I'm better on time, but I kind of know the main parts of the presentation a little bit better. Yeah, I'm almost pretty close to reading it. I'm relying pretty heavily on that outline, but I can remember some basic things. I kind of remember where the huge chunks of the presentation are. So I run it that second time. Then I sit down and reflect on it. And now I've kind of got some narrower reflections. There's some parts I'm like, that was fun and awesome. And then there are other parts where I'm like, I bored myself. That was terrible. So I want to reflect on what are sort of the big chunks of the presentation, which ones are working and which ones aren't. Then again, I'm going through revision. Maybe now I'm cutting entire points or entire sections of the speech. I may or may not be doing massive goal changes because I've already sort of gone through that pass, but I'm really starting to take a harder look at inclusion, exclusion. What gets into the speech? What do I just not have time for? What needs to be kicked out of the speech? So I've run it, I've reflected, I've revised it, and then we go into round 3. So I take another pass. If I'm labeling this one, this is sort of getting all those main speech parts in line. So I'm running it, and you know what? Normally here, I'll run it twice in a row back to back. Because you know what I'm doing now? I'm really getting to the point where I kind of know the content. Maybe now what I want to do is time my various chunks. So I want to know, how long am I spending in my introduction? How long am I spending in that part, part 3? How long is that taking? So I've got a timer with me, I'm practicing it, and I'm writing down where my time breaks are. So I run the speech, I've kind of got a greater sense for it. Now I sit down and reflect again, and here's where I sort of go in my head, I'm like, boy, I really like all this material, but I'm tight on time, and I just have to remind myself, you can't game the system. It's not just a matter of going faster. That's not what you want. I got to cut stuff. I'm probably in the stage of cutting stuff. And so at this stage, these cuts hurt. I really like this section, but it's got to go. No, maybe I can. No, seriously, you cannot. It has to go. So I'm making those hard cuts, and that's what's happening in the revisions. I'm checking those time allocations. Am I spending the most time where I want to be spending the most time, or where I need to be spending the most time? That timing those chunks is really important information when I'm making revisions, because I'm like, well, is this matching up with what I want? And in that sense, I also want to check my overall congruency. If I said I had 3 main objectives or 3 goals for the audience, I want to look at those goals and say, am I really accomplishing those in this speech? If I am, great. If I'm not, do I need to go back and change those goals? Do I need to change my sense of what the audience is? Or do I need to make some revisions to the outline itself? So I'm doing a pass for congruency. So then we enter final phase, just style and polish. So I run it. Once again, I'll run it twice in a row, and by now I want to be pretty close to my time mark. If I've got 10 minutes for the speech, I should be coming in roughly around there. I'll probably say this again under delivery, but if you're presenting a speech for a live audience, you should probably, in practice, get it to about 85% of your time allocation. So if you've got a 10-minute speech, in practice, ideally you'd want to be coming in closer to 8:30. And that's because that means when you get up in front of that audience, you can play around with them, right? Something happens, you can respond to it, you can talk to them. You don't have to race, because you're probably going to be going faster in practice than you will in performance. So you want to be able to give yourself enough relaxing time to play around with that audience, have fun, relax a little bit. And so I want to make sure that I know what my maximum time is, so that in this final stage, when I'm timing my chunks, If I've got a 10-minute speech, I'm coming in between 8.5 to 9 minutes, because then I don't have to worry about going over when I get into that actual speech setting. So I run the speech. I run it twice again. I'm timing my chunks. Reflection. All right, well, at this point, I should like most of the speech. And one thing that emerges at this stage is I kind of know where I could potentially go off on a tangent. So it's like, oh, I've got a ton of content there. If I don't watch myself, I'll go off for 5 minutes talking about that. So I can either write around that or plan around that, or at the very least, I got to know it. So I'm like, when I reach that point, I'm like, just shut up, keep going. Remember, this works. Don't go off on a tangent. Don't say that out loud. Your audience won't know what you're talking about. They'll think you're a little odd. But so I kind of know where those different potentials for wandering tangents are. In terms of revisions, I'm probably making small revisions. I'm tweaking some of the points. Maybe I'm changing up some of the phrasing, probably in those main point labels or those sub-claim labels. And I'm checking to make sure that that style is accessible. I'm not relying too heavily on jargon. So that's the ideal model. And at the end of this, the speech has probably gone through about 4 or 5 revisions with probably about 6 or 8 run-throughs. And this actually doesn't take as much time as you think. When I walk you through the sample one I did, this is something you can do over a span of days, and it kind of works well in that regard. But it doesn't take as much time as you might think, and even if it did, it would be worth it, because the results in the actual performance of the speech are so evidently clear. Because you just know the speech. You don't have to read it. You have revised this speech in a way that makes it so you can deliver it well. Okay? But that's my ideal model. I don't have always all the time in the world to do that. So I do kind of have a shorter model. The shorter model is trying to tap into some of the basic ideas of that longer model. So once again, I'll probably start out by planning the speech, getting all that information into one massive document. Maybe I make more changes and revisions to that massive document before I run it. Nevertheless, I plan, I run the speech, I reflect on it, I revise it. Those are probably some pretty big changes. Then I again run the speech, reflect on it, and revise it with smaller changes in mind, and maybe, that's it. So then it's probably gone through maybe 2 or 3 run-throughs with 1 or 2 revision passes. And regardless of whether or not you do the ideal version or the short version or somewhere in between those two, the main thing is, the most important thing is that you are using practice as a way of guiding your composition. And that just helps you out so much. Remember, weeks back, we talked about the difference between literacy and orality. And so you're using writing, but you're also using orality as a check on your writing. This is why speech writing is tough. It is often very difficult to write for the ear as opposed to the eye. But in practicing it and paying attention to your own performance, you're revising that written content based on what you want to say. So let me go ahead and I'll wrap this up in a little bit, but right now let's go ahead and take a very brief pause, and I'm going to show you what this might look like. So just a little bit of context here. That's about a year and a half ago, maybe something like that. I was asked to give a 45-minute keynote address at a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Symposium. So I had to present on teaching and learning, and I had some research and some thoughts. And I want to go through my various drafts very briefly as a sort of an archaeological way of demonstrating this method. So let's go ahead and do that now.